I've been waiting to do this countdown list for a long time. I had everything prepared, but of course, my opportunity was wasted. But anyways, I'm finally back bringing the countdown series, and I'm gonna start with the Sly Cooper series. I played through this series, same with the Ratchet & Clank games, played through all 4 of them, and enjoyed them for the most part. But I figured I would do a countdown list on the bosses of the series. I know this list has been kinda done to death by various people, but I figured I would share out my own picks of my 10 personal favorites from the series. And I have come to the conclusion that I have decided to split the best and the worst, just to let you know. Now, regarding this series, the bosses themselves were harder to pick than the Ratchet & Clank franchise, because a lot of fights, there are a few good ones, but most of the others range from existing. But luckily I was able to find 10 of my personal best picks from the series. So, strap in, because I'm going over why I like these fights based on the fights themselves, fun difficulty, gimmicks that are presented into the fight, the characters and the backstories themselves, the whole role into the entire game, and how they present themselves compared to like what we're going to be seeing for later down on the list. So, hope you all are prepared, because we're ready to take a look at the best of the best. I forgot to mention that mini bosses are allowed on the list, and surprisingly we are starting off with a mini boss from Sly 4, the Moat Monster, and surprisingly the only mini boss that exists in the game. And I think it's for the best, because this mini boss is pretty good, especially being in one of my favorite episodes in the series as a whole. The deal with this 3-headed serpent is that it will shoot out fireballs at you and barrages of missiles that can be destroyed, and also spitting out flamethrower onto the arena. To damage it, you have to shoot into the flamethrower canister in the mouth, then you do a quick time event, where you have to blast the thing's eye into smithereens. The grid laser will also appear in on the floor, but it's pretty easy and noticeable to dodge. This fight gets pretty hectic and tricky to handle with the amount of projectiles it throws in, but still really manageable and makes for a pretty fun fight. And surprisingly one of the few mini bosses that I actually enjoyed from the series. So I think this mini boss is perfectly fine enough for me in the game. However, it is pretty easy to handle, and the thing itself doesn't have any character personality wise, which is why it's so low, but it would still be one of the few mini bosses that I actually enjoyed. It's finally feeling good to talk about a mini boss that doesn't suck. Mugshot. Now let's actually get into a proper boss, and one of the 2 bosses from Sly 1 that I actually enjoyed fighting against. Despite being the second boss, this guy can be a bit tricky to handle with his gimmick and how you proceed through him. To beat him, you have to hit the mirrors to reflect onto the crystals to overheat his guns, while Mugshot tries to chase you around and gun you down. This can be pretty tricky to try to avoid his attacks, as he is relentless on killing you. And also, the mirror reflecting gimmick almost reminds me of the King Neptune boss fight from the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. Well, I guess it shows which game did it first. The arena will get less spacey around, as you have to avoid Mugshot and try to make your way to the mirrors. Especially during the final part where it keeps you on your toes and you have to hop around while timing when to move so you don't get gunned down. The fight itself is pretty simple and basic, which is why it's kinda low as well, but still, it's simple but effective nonetheless. And I still will give it credit for what it has to offer. Also, the music for the fight is weirdly one of my favorites. Don't know why, but I really like it. Mugshot himself is far from one of the most memorable characters in the series. He is a pretty decent character overall, and he does have a nice backstory. He was a little kid bullied by other dogs around him, so he always goes up to the movie theaters and being inspired by movies of gangsters, and he too grew up to train himself to become a badass gangster himself, and gain some payback in the process. It's a pretty solid backstory overall, and I do appreciate what it has to offer. His voice is pretty fine overall, and I do like the interaction he had with Sly. It was kind of nice to see him back in Sly 3, even if his fight is severely downgraded. Jean Bison. Well, I'm gonna be completely honest, this is gonna be the only boss from Sly 2 making the list, since, in my opinion, Sly 2 has by far the worst lineup of bosses in the series. It's a shame too, since the characters, their backstories, and everything were good, but the bosses themselves are just really existing. Jean Bison himself, despite having the best fight, also has probably the weakest backstory in my opinion. The deal with him is that he once was an explorer in Canada in search for gold during the gold rush, and thus, when he continued his treachery, it led to him getting buried in snow and frozen for so many years. And despite being frozen, he broke out and is still alive to this day in the game. And he plans on taming the wildlife by chopping down on the trees and claiming the land as his own. It's an okay backstory, and Bison himself is an okay character overall. But at least his boss fight is something, I guess. The deal with this fight, you take control of Bentley and you have to use the traps in order to damage him, which thus plays a big part of the thinking process. You have to utilize the logs, the saw blades, and the fire to damage Bison while he tries to chase after you, throwing dynamite and sending in his cronies to try to attack you. The traps themselves can also hurt you, so you have to keep mindful of your surroundings so that way you don't get hurt and you can damage him in the process. It's a pretty simple fight, but one I found to be a bit more enjoyable as you have to be on your toes and utilize the environment rather than just the fight being a standard punch the guy multiple times until he's dead. Which to me with Sly 2 was kinda lame since the other characters are more interesting, but at least Bison, serving as the penultimate boss in the game, actually did make up for it overall. Wish I can say the same about the endgame though. I'ma be real honest. The pirate episode from Sly 3 is the worst episode in the series. I don't like it. The pirate motif is cool, but the whole entire levels surrounding it aren't really that fun to play through. The ship section is by far the worst thing ever. It's clunky to control, and it's not fun to use. It just makes the level drag on even further. Seriously, is there nothing positive I can even say about this? Well, there is one positive, and that being the mini-boss fight against Crusher the Octopus. Surprisingly, it does have one good thing to add on to. So what's the deal with this giant octopus attempting to destroy your ship? You take control of the Panda King and you have to fire fireworks at the tentacles while it tries to pull your ship down. So you have to keep wary of your surroundings and fend off as many tentacles as you can, as more of them will appear on the further you progress through the fight. Crusher himself will also show up and fire fireballs at you. I don't know how that works, but it just does. Anyways, you have to avoid that while also shooting the fireworks at its face, I guess. Don't even know. Anyways, you still have to continue fending off the tentacles and avoiding the fireballs in the process, and keep wary of your surroundings, avoiding the attacks, and managing up all the fireworks you have. After that bit is done, you take control of Sly now, and you have to smack the tentacles to keep them still. The second phase can be a bit tricky as the tentacles don't stay on the ship for very long, and you have to be quick with smacking them all so that way you can bring Crusher closer to the ship and smack the cannons to fire at his face. Repeat this process 2 or 3 times to win. It's a pretty simple fight, but overall I think it does get the job done. And it does it very well, and at least it could have been the end boss for this whole entire episode instead of what we got as the actual end boss to the episode itself. So at least there's one positive I can say to one of the worst episodes in my opinion. So good job, Crusher. At least you're able to make the list. Miss Decibel. Honestly, this is quite a pretty good penultimate boss to the fourth Sly game, as penultimate bosses aren't really the series' strong suit. But at least the fourth game was able to give us a pretty good fight overall. But as for the character herself, she's kinda lame. She's basically what Paradox's bitch. So obsessed and trying to make up to him in the best ways possible, and it was just kind of weird, but you do you, girl. She does have quite an interesting backstory. She was a musician playing the trumpet, but her music was awful to many people and got hated on. This resulted in the trumpet getting stuck in her trunk and playing a weird melody that causes people to get hypnotized into her music, so she used this to take advantage for crimes. It is quite an interesting backstory, as I do understand where she's going with this whole entire gimmick, and thus it leads us to a very solid gimmick in her boss fight, utilizing the awful power of music entirely. As for the first phase of the fight, you have to hop across glass panels while she's breaking them, and hopping across some strings while avoiding these electric orbs that can instant kill you. I experienced that the hard way. It is a pretty tricky first phase to avoid all the attacks, and you have to utilize the time slowing gimmick from your costume to make your way to Miss Decibel. After you get to her, you have to avoid her sets of attacks that she'll send out after you and wait for her to get stunned, so that way you can give her a smack in the face. You repeat this process a couple times for the first phase, and it is a pretty solid first phase overall. The second phase is not really that interesting, but it still is fun enough. The deal with this phase is that you have to avoid Miss Decibel's barrages of attacks and her awful power of music, then gain a smack on her and making her run into these generators. You have to utilize the time slowing gimmick since she is pretty fast, especially for a big ass elephant, and you have to make sure she gets damaged by it or else you'll miss the opportunity. As I said, the second phase isn't anything special, but it still is keeping the pace of the fight, and it does make the fight quite challenging and fun overall. I do like how the fight is varied out, and it is quite an enjoyable feat overall. I did dislike how she gets betrayed by the Paradox at the end. What a coward! He wishes boss fight was at least half as good as everyone else in the game. Dr. M. One of the two main villains of the series that's actually pretty solid, and one of the two final bosses that's actually pretty good. So what's the deal with Dr. M? Being a mad scientist, he once was part of the Cooper gang, Sly's father, and serving as the brains of the group. They all had their fun times together, but Dr. M felt jealousy amongst the group. He hated that he was always played as second fiddle and being treated as the sidekick of Sly's father, so in exchange, he goes out of his way to try to ravage the Cooper Vault for himself by building a fortress that is impossible to go through and has prepared out every single ounce of traps and alarms that he has in his disposal. Mutant monsters, all the guards, everything he has to offer to prevent Sly from getting into the vault, because he really lost over that treasure they were hiding for so many years. He also tries to rival out with Bentley and convincing Bentley that he shouldn't be played as second fiddle and being treated as the sidekick of the group. It does make him an interesting villain where he's trying to go with his whole motivation and convincing. And overall, he does a pretty solid job with his role as the villain, despite the lack of screen time throughout the entire game. Kinda wish he had that. But anyways, serving as the game's final boss, he does put up a pretty solid fight overall. So what's the deal with this boss battle? Well, Dr. M will fly off into the background and shoot fireballs at you, and you have to drag him down into the arena, so he attaches himself into this contraption to fire a laser. You have to hide behind the vehicles to avoid getting hit by the laser. And then there's the actual fight against Dr. M. Dr. M will utilize his claw machine to try to smack you around, charge attacks, and slamming onto you. He also utilizes 3 different elemental powers, and they change throughout each part of his health depending on which phase he's in. In phase 1, he'll shoot out water bubbles. In phase 2, electricity. In phase 3, he'll send out fire. Each of these elemental attacks also upgrade his normal attacks, such as his charge attack creating electricity and fire lanes, and a shockwave fire blast for phase 3 when he does the slam attack. This fight is very tricky to maneuver around with, but it also is pretty fun and offers different varieties on how you counteract Dr. M by utilizing the different attack methods and when to time on striking the Mad Doctor. You can be on the laser grid to avoid the fireballs while he shoots projectiles at you, or you charge in and try to wear at him in the meantime. This fight is pretty darn fun, although I will say that it doesn't really feel epic or, spectacular as one would expect from a final boss, but I can let that slide as long as the fight itself is actually pretty fun. The last phase you take control of Carmelita and you just gun him down while he shoots fireballs at you is pretty easy, but it is a nice conclusion. Overall, Dr. M really does a good job serving as the final boss and a pretty good end to the Sly Cooper trilogy as a whole. So, I'll give the Mad Doctor for that. If only the 4th game actually did better. The Black Knight. One of the few other bosses from Sly 4 that I also really like and enjoyed fighting against. And the Black Knight also turns out to be Penelope. Well, that's a odd twist. Also, here's the thing. I wasn't amazed by the plot twist because I played Sly 4 first, and I played Sly 3 last. So, yeah, I wasn't fazed by it, but even then, the whole portrayal is just kinda underwhelming. If only they explained out a bit more on why she betrayed the gang instead of just being like, oh, I'm going to do it for the best for us, or just in for money, power, I don't even freaking know. It doesn't get well explained. But even with that awful plot twist aside, how's the actual fight? Well, considering how high up in the list it is, it's actually pretty good. The deal with the Black Knight mech suit is that you have to avoid the lasers, barrages of missiles, and its fist doing a slam attack, causing shockwaves around the arena. To damage this boss, you have to fire the arrows while avoiding getting it into the force field, like in the circular area, and hitting it on the shoulder. You have to be quick as the Black Knight's mech can use the laser to destroy the rope entirely. You have to do a little QT to destroy each of the shoulder pads and the chest core entirely. Repeat this process 2 more times to win the first phase. And then after that, Penelope will actually come out in the Black Knight suit, and Bentley comes in to finally get his redemption and get a chance to fight this bitch. The second phase isn't really that hard or exciting as it's a simple brawler. The controls can be a bit clunky, but still manageable overall. You have to avoid Penelope's attacks and wait until you get the opportunity to damage her in the process. Repeat this process a few times to win the fight, and finally get that bitch out of here. Sheesh, terrible plot twist, am I right? Overall, the Black Knight does put up a good fight, and it gives off a sense of scale, a fun and challenging fight that's intense but also fair, a second phase that is quite satisfying to beat up and go through, and I would definitely say this was a pretty solid end to one of my favorite episodes in Sly 4 as a whole. So, at least I'll remember Penelope for this pretty good fight rather than her terrible plot twist of being a villain in the series. Kind of a shame too, since we won't get a 5th game to see what happens later on. El Jefe. The first boss from Sly 4, and surprisingly the only good one. Just like with penultimate bosses, first bosses are easily the weakest when it comes to the fights. But luckily the 4th game does have us a pretty good introduction boss. For starters, El Jefe is one of the coolest looking villains in the series, a badass looking tiger with katanas, and is just really a great start. His backstory is also quite interesting, as he was a high-ranking mercenary and a major strategist who was able to conquer various countries around the world, and with his proper planning and strategies, he was able to do all of that single-handedly and with very little effort whatsoever, all to the highest bidder. And El Jefe himself does put up a pretty damn good fight. So what's the deal with this tiger? Well, there are some platforming segments in between phases where he'll send out fireballs and you have to traverse around while avoiding the fire and his barrages of fireballs he will send after you. This is pretty tricky, but it is a nice little change of pace overall. Then there's the actual fight against El Jefe. El Jefe himself will utilize the powers of fire and electricity. Surprising how that works. His katana will bring out various electric attacks that he'll swipe at you and drag towards you, and also creating electric orbs throughout the later phases of the fight. He also creates fire waves and a fire blast. You have to utilize the samurai suit to avoid getting hit by that fire blast. To beat him, you have to use the samurai suit to reflect a fireball that he'll send back at you, and then once you reflect it, you give him a good old smacking in the face. This fight is pretty hectic and kind of reminds me of the Dingodile fight from Crunch Twin Sandy, a boss utilizing different variety of attacks that you have to avoid and waiting for the perfect opportunity to damage him. Luckily, the attacks don't drag, and the fight is a pretty perfect pace and length to what it has to offer, and a very good first boss that I really got excited for the later portion of the game. It also doesn't help the fact that he's also voiced by Nolan North, which to me is also a plus in itself overall. So good job, El Jefe. You at least made it into my list of best first bosses I've faced thus far. Clockwork. Here he is, so close to number 1, but he does get the silver medal in my opinion. Clockwork is one of the other 2 final bosses in the series that is actually good. Dr. M definitely made it up for the 3rd game and being a solid end to the series. It's a shame that Clockline with Paradox couldn't even hold a candle. But surprisingly, the first Sly Cooper game manages to bring us a very good final boss. What's the deal with Clockwork? He is a giant mechanical owl, well, was during a long time ago, who has lived for hundreds of years with a steady diet of jealousy and hatred towards the Cooper clan. He stayed alive for so long just to wipe out this family's thieving reputation, and was the one responsible for killing Sly's father in the process. I don't know what drove this mechanical owl to hating them and wanting to be a big, huge master thief, considering he's a giant frickin' owl, but it is what it is, because the backstory behind him is very menacing, and he was foreshadowed throughout the entire game, and all leading us to a strange final reunion. In this fight, you take control of the jetpack. The controls are kinda clunky, but not really bad, which by the way, you can change them from not inverted in the control settings, just to let you know. But anyways, throughout these 2 phases of utilizing the jetpack, Clockwork will shoot out fireballs that you have to avoid in an easy first phase, while getting the handle of the jetpack. Carmelita will also shoot at the weak points that you have to shoot at in order to damage the armor on Clockwork. The second phase is the tricky part, as you have to fly in between the rings to avoid getting electrified. It is a pretty tricky second phase to maneuver around in, but I still like it for offering a good challenge, especially towards a final boss fight. The last segment is a bit of a platforming segment where you have to make your way towards Clockwork's head while avoiding the lasers, projectiles, and not getting scorched up in the process. Then once you make it to his head, you have to smack it a few times, thus ending the battle at Clockwork for good. This is a pretty good final boss fight, and overall it does end the first game as a whole. The music is also one of the few standouts in the series, as it's a pretty solid final boss theme in my opinion, and one of the best soundtracks in the entire series. The fight itself is pretty simple, as one would expect from a final boss, but simple but still effective enough nonetheless. So overall, I still give this owl the credit that he deserves. But who could possibly be number one for me? Well, there is one dickhead who manages to overtop Clockwork as being an ass. General Tsao. This guy has to be the biggest douche I have ever seen. A hateable character that is done right, along with all the other hateable characters that are done right in terms of villain quality. He is my personal favorite in terms of boss fight and his role as the antagonist. Well, mostly. His backstory is alright. He comes from a family lineup of generations, and to continue his family legacy, he kidnaps the Panda King's daughter into a forced marriage. Yep, just to continue his legacy, let's kidnap. Because why not? Even the dialogue he says here just shows how much of a scumbag this guy is. Even Sly says it himself.
She's a woman. She doesn't know up from down.
I've faced a lot of bad men in my time, but you, sir, are the worst.
Clockwork. But anyway, then there's the actual fight against Tsao, and it's actually pretty darn good. Starting with the first phase, Sly has to gleefully glide across the bamboos and wait for the perfect opportunity to damage Tsao by smacking him in the face, while avoiding his buzzsaw shield and barrages of fireballs. This phase is pretty tricky to maneuver around with because of the limited space and projectiles Tsao will send after you. You have to time your attacks just right to avoid getting hit by that buzzsaw shield in the process. Pretty straightforward, am I right? Yep, pretty straightforward, I do say so myself. This phase is pretty tricky to maneuver around in, but still is fun regardless. However, the second phase is where things become even better, as Tsao is relentless on killing you. He barely flinches for most attacks. He will make sure to put up his shield to avoid getting smacked in the process, and you have to time where to smack him and avoid taking damage overall. He also will be relentless on you as sending out zombie hands and dragon spears to try to hit you. There's no safe way to avoid his attacks, since even hopping on the bamboos, he'll just cut it down like it's nothing. This open arena, combined with the intensity of the music, which is kinda okay, does make for a pretty hectic and fun fight. Kinda reminds me of a hack and slash boss fight in particular. This fight can be very challenging to maneuver around in, and overall, it's one of the few bosses that I enjoyed. A beat-em-up boss that's actually fun, requires some thinking and strategy on whether to attack, avoiding his barrages of attacks, being challenging at the same time, and still offering a douchebag of a character. So overall, I wish Tsao was the actual main boss of the episode instead of the stone dragon that we got in the end. But it is what it is, and I will still applaud the third game for offering us one of the best boss fights in the entire series. Well, that's the list overall, and finally, it's been a long time doing these lists. I'm going to do the worst bosses in the meantime, so I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time. Take care, my friends. What are your favorites? Do you agree or disagree? Let me know in the comments below. See ya.
I've faced a lot of bad men in my time, but you, sir, are the worst.
Oh, it gets worse, Koopa.